All right, here we are in chapter 4, functions. Now we're going to start understanding why we've been adding that main thing, right? Remember you're doing def main with the little parentheses on the sides and calling main. So I was using that to try to get you in the habit of using functions. I wanted you to be using functions before I started teaching you about them because I want you to kind of get comfortable with the idea and then realize this is what it does and how that's easy. I don't have to worry about that. So let's just jump right into that today. So functions are a way for us to maintain some modularity and some reusability in our programs. So think about this. When we're doing functions, we do things like print and input type. You've been using them all this time. It's just you didn't really know what they were, right? And then things like def main, where you're actually writing your own. So the idea here is that a function is a hunk of code that's modular and reusable. And a lot of times we don't know how it works. For instance, the print function, when you guys say print, here's my user-friendly output, you don't know why or how that works. You just know that it works, and that's okay when you're working with functions. The idea is that there are essentially black boxes that we don't have to worry about. So think about when you define an argument, right? So you currently are, I'm trying to think of the best way to talk about this. When you use something like print, you're actually putting something inside parentheses to send it and bring it back. Let's look at an example of that. So here's a function. Actually, let's do an even better idea. Let's switch over to idle and just do a very specific example here. So when you use a print function, say you say print. This is my output, right? And you run that and you get print to come out. You don't really think about what that does, how that works. But here's what's happening. You're actually passing an argument, right? That's what we call this thing right here. And we're passing this argument to print. What we're saying is take this string and send it to a function called print. And then print does all the magic that makes it show up down here on your output, right? So that's what we're talking about. When we use any function, that's what's going on. Let's grab my pen here. So for instance, this is an argument, all right? I've got this string, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and I'm passing it to a function called max, all right? So this information here goes over here, and then the result of that, of course, gets assigned over here, right? So what's happening is it's looking at this string. It's finding the largest value in the string. That's what max does. It says find the largest value in the string. And then, of course, here's another one. I've got an argument called largest number in string. What is that? Well, that's just a variable, right? So I'm saying pass this argument, which is my variable of largest number in string, pass it to a function called print. And then the function print says, all right, well, I'm going to print out what this function gave me, which is 9. All right, that's what's going on. And again, it's not super critical that you know why print works or why max works, only that you use it, right? We call this a black box. All right, this right here, this max function. We don't actually know why it works. We just know that it does. Now, we can look at it, we can learn why it works. We can certainly take a look at all of that, take a look at all of that code and determine how it's working. But at the root of things, it's not necessary. We can just know that if we send 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to a function called max, max is going to return a value of 9. Right? So here it is kind of breaking things down a little bit. Inside of max is another function, right? It's stuff that you've written. They've defined it just like you defined main. They accepted an input, and then they did stuff with it, and then pass it back out. And that's what we're going to learn to do today, is we're going to learn how to use these functions and then write our own. So here's another example. Here's a type conversion. So we're starting as 9. Right? And I'll grab a dark pen there. We start as 9. So we say this is an int, 9, right? That's what start as int has the value 9. And then we're going to convert it, right? We're going to pass this integer of 9 to a function called float, right? And then we're going to pass that float to here, right? Now, for those of you looking at it going, no, it's not really a 9. Well, remember, we didn't take this as an input string. We took it as a constant here, or as a variable, but we took it directly. So it implicitly got assigned as an int. So for those of you thinking that you caught me on something, not this time. There are plenty of opportunities to catch me in mistakes, though. All right, so here's another. If we move from 42, right, same thing. 42 starts as a string in this case, right? Because right there we're assigning a string of 42. So we take the string, same thing. We pass a string to a function called float, right? Which converts it to a float, prints it out as a float, over and over and over again, right? So this is the way things work. Now, so keep in mind we're doing strings just because we're on that subject. You can't convert a string to a number. It has to be a number in the first place, right? Python knows the difference. So with that said, let's talk about building functions of our own. So this is the part where I talk about the Lumberjack song, and if you don't know the Lumberjack song, you should go look it up. I'm not going to add it to my videos here because I'm adding it to YouTube, and I'll probably get flagged for copying it or something. But if you do Monty Python Lumberjack song, you can see the joke. It is interesting to note that the Python language was in fact named after Monty Python, which is why when you're learning Python, you tend to see inside jokes on Monty Python. For those of you that don't know Monty Python, you should check it out. It may or may not appeal to you. It's a bunch of old guys by today's standards, but it can be pretty funny. But anyway, that's a totally separate aside. So as you've learned, we use this def word, right? I've got you guys doing that now when you create def main. Main is the first function that we use by convention. It's not required. That's just the one we use. And then I give the function a name. In this case, my function is called print_lyrics. And I always have to use these parentheses. And of course, I always end with the 2 dots, the colon. Right? So inside, remember block, those indentations are important. Inside this function's job is to execute these 2 lines of code. It just prints 2 lines of code. That's all it does when it's called. What do I mean when it's called? So this should look familiar. There's your def main, and I'm doing stuff inside there. So the way Python reads programs is it looks at these things and it says, all right, I'm going to start from top to bottom. Right, and just to kind of go through this, it doesn't read that because that's comments, doesn't read comments. It doesn't read that because that's main, and it can't read that until it's called. Of course, it can't read anything inside of main. And so it goes on, it ignores that and ignores that. It ignores that because that's a function that hasn't been called. It ignores that and that because it's inside the function, it ignores that. So the very first line of code that is actually read by Python is that one right there. And that's called a function call. See, there's no def in front of it. It's just main. That says go to main. All right, so let's clean up all my lines here. All right, so main says go to main. So it goes up here to main. Now main gets read. It says, okay, I'm in main. Print this function. Now this function prints, and then it ignores this line. And ignores this line. Does it run this? No, because there's no function call. So it ignores that, and ignores that, and we are done. End. Right? Why didn't this run? Well, simple. There's no call for that function. Right? There's no print lyrics, parenthesis, anywhere. So the only thing that ran was the main function. Right? So that's kind of an important distinction. You've got to call these functions before they'll actually run. So when we call a function or invoke it, I'll usually say call, invoke is also correct. What happens is the function actually operates. And I hear my phone dinging. I was going to turn that off, but that's all right. We'll just let it ding as needed. Once we have a function, we can use it over and over again. That's this idea of reusable code. Remember, we use print over and over and over. We use input over and over and over. It doesn't expire, it doesn't spoil if we leave it in the code, right? It's there for us to use as we need it. All right, so Arguments, that's that thing we're passing in. An argument is simply the thing that gets passed to a function. Simple. We put the argument inside the parentheses. That's how the function knows what to do with it. So here's an example. Here's an argument. Let me change colors. This argument gets passed to print. And then this assignment happens here. So what happens is I print, this is the main function. I assign 42 to the variable myNumber. I then pass the variable myNumber to print, and print prints it out. Easy. All right. Returns. Now we're going to get a little bit deeper into things. So once something does something, it turns out it can pass it back. So take a look at this. We've got this main. Remember, none of this runs. We go all the way down. We hit main. Main says go to main. All right, so now main runs. Run the block. It says print. This is the main function. Main function comes out. Then it says, all right, this is the argument. The lyrics are lyrics, which gets passed to print. Well, what happens when it gets passed to print? Look at this. This right here is also a function call. See? Lyrics, bracket, bracket, or excuse me, parenthesis, parenthesis, and down here, here's a function called lyrics, parenthesis, parenthesis. So what happens is it prints. This is the main function. Then, before it can pass this to print, it calls lyrics. So lyrics, so it comes down here and says, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay, which gets passed to a return. Return, what return's job is to send it back where it came from. So what happens is return says, okay, take I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay, and pass it back to where I got called, to this lyrics call. So you can see what happens down here. It prints, this is the main function, and then it prints, this is the lyrics are, and then it prints, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay, which is all being handled there. Now, if this is a little confusing, that's okay. This is usually one of those spots in the class where people go, ah, right? And that's normal. Don't freak out, right? This is a place where people get confused. It takes a little time for some folks. If you're one of the lucky ones that looked at that and went, ah, got it. Cool, awesome. Happy for you. If you're one of those that's going, yeah, no, I don't get it. That's okay, that's normal. That's why we do all of this programming. That's why we practice so much. Once you've practiced this, it starts becoming kind of obvious. So with that said, let me give you a big example. This big example is my tiny calculator. And hopefully you can read it. If not, I'll post this code out on Canvas so you can look it over. You're actually going to write some of this yourself anyway. So you can see that there's a whole bunch of things happening here. Well, in a nutshell, there's not really a lot going on. Remember, all of this, it gets ignored until we get to a call to main. Main says go to main. So it goes up here to main. All right, we accept a number, convert it to an int. So what's going to do, it's going to pass this first one. It says, all right, enter number 1, pass that into the input function, then pass it to the int function, save it as number 1, same thing, save it as number 2. All right, now we can see there's some more stuff inside this function. What's happening here? Well, the very first thing that happens is answer add. Well, answer add takes the two variables I just set, passes them to add. All right, so those two variables come down here to add. They are accepted here. Here and here. Now you'll notice I use different variable names. That's important to remember. You should always use different variable names between the two different things. Why? Because it's confusing and that makes it fun. No, because we want you to remember that these are reusable. It doesn't matter what the function names are. Right? I can call these anything I want. I can call them N1, N2, I call it A1, A2, I can call it number 1, number 2, I can call it Bubba and Sam. It doesn't matter because it only works inside the scope of this one function. This doesn't know about the rest of the program. It just sits there all by itself. It's like a little tiny program all by itself. Now what its job is to just add two things together and then return them. So number add passes these two values. They're accepted as N1 and N2. So let's say I'm using numbers 4 and 7. So 4 and 7 get passed to add. 4 and 7 comes down here. It gets applied to N1 and N2. So now that's 4 and that's 7. I add 4 plus 7, 12. right? And then 12 comes back here and gets put into answer add. So now answer add has the value of 12, right? And that goes on over and over and over again through the whole program. If you run it, you can see this happen. Same program, I've just taken out all those comments to make it a little easier. So passing numbers to the function. The returned numbers come back. And that happens for each one of them. 4 and 7 pass here to this one, and they come back. 4 and 7 come here to Bob and Sam. Remember, names don't matter. Bob gets divided by Sam, comes back. Same thing. And then all of them, let's change colors because it's getting really confusing now. All of them get moved here in answer add. Oh, that's fun. And get sent down here to these values to be printed out. And again, if that's confusing, don't freak out. Practice makes perfect. So another thing to note, you saw in that last slide, I actually had a bunch of different things come together. So I can pass and return as many as I want. So you can see that this gives me great flexibility in my programming because I can, once these have values, 4, 7, 6, 12, whatever, I can then do whatever I want with them. I can show them as addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So I'm just printing these things out to say what they do. And then I can actually use them down here and they make sense. All right, so that's kind of what's going on. And again, I'm going to do a separate video where I do just this program. So if this is a little confusing for you, look for that small video where I walk through just that program again and explain it because it's part of our in-class assignments to work on something similar. All right, same thing is for coming back. Let's say you can see in this calculation, I need just a little bit bigger pen here. You can see in this calculation here, this function does a bunch of different calculations. And all of those calculations are returned. Well, it works the same way. Remember how I could send multiple numbers here? Turns out I can receive multiple numbers. I just got to do each one separated by a comma, right? Same idea. And you can see again that it can simplify code. Sometimes it makes it more complicated. In this case, it made it easier for me just simply because I could write all of my formulas out very simply. It doesn't look like simple code, but from a writing standpoint, it's actually pretty easy. Now the problem is a calculation this small is not a great use of a program this big, but that's irrelevant. We're just learning right now, so we stick with it for now. A couple of quick notes. Void functions. If you hear me refer to a void function, what I mean is a function that doesn't return anything. So remember back here, this is returning something right here. See return? So that's a function. That's what we call a fruitful function, or just a function. This is a void function. And we know it's a void function because there's no word return. This function does stuff, but it doesn't send anything back. That's only important in this case because, like, if I say create a void function, you know there's no return, right? That's really all there is to it. And a function or not a function. Generally speaking, in this class, you're going to use a lot of functions. We want functions for everything. That's because typically in programming, we tend to use the same code over and over and over again. Take a game, for instance. If a guy is going to jump over a wall, I might write a function for jump, right? And write a function for wall. Now I can reuse either of those and mix them together, right? So if I need a guy to jump over a car, I could still use my jump function. Now I just use jump function and car function. If he needs to jump a wall, I use the jump function and the wall function. If he needs to crawl under a wall, I write a function called crawl, use crawl function and wall function. So reusable, so I'm not writing all of that code over and over and over again. Right? So in this one, not too long, we talked about functions, built-ins, we did a little bit of conversion, we talked a little about parameters and arguments, and why to use functions. Be sure to watch the other videos that I create for this. Again, I'm going to work through some of these things in little small bits and pieces, because sometimes this is one of those where rather than skimming through a whole review, it's easier just to look at the bits and pieces where I'm doing the specific programming. So be sure to review those over and over if you need to, and reach out on Piazza if you've got questions.